Hey, oh, look at that.
Hey,
Hello.
calling. Yeah, we're surprised. 5 years
I
in,
know,
we're
right?
surprised every time. We're like, oh my God, we're live.
You showed up. Calling
Calling.
Rick Fire, and where are you? You look
I'm
like
in Arnhem, Netherlands.
still, or was there something that happened in between the last time you were in Arnhem?
Oh no, that was 2 weeks ago. I was someplace else in between, but I'm back in Arnhem with my group. I hope some of them are watching. They certainly said they would be, but I have no way of checking on them. And we're here, and we leave tomorrow for. We're gonna do the bridge at Arnhem tomorrow morning, and then we're gonna do Battle of the Bulge sites and end up in Hoflees, Belgium. And how about you, Chris Anderson? You look like you are in London.
I am, believe it or not. I got home yesterday, and so I'm like washing laundry and opening mail and seeing what it's like to actually be back in London. So that's good.
And when do you head out again?
I should be. Well, I'm going on vacation.
Woo.
I'm going to Crete in 3 weeks. So
Nice, awesome.
Yeah.
Well, welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for sending Chris and I on the road and helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether we're watching live or watching on replay or listening on the HHH podcast,
there you go.
We're glad you're here. Today we're going to be talking about an adventure story in the Falkland Islands, more than 200 years old. Before we do that, we want to thank our Patreon supporters. And here they are. I haven't made any changes to this week, so it's just the same as last week. Hopefully it's error-free. Quick, scan it, Chris.
Quick. Oh yeah, I can tell right from here. It's all perfect.
And we appreciate all of our patrons, especially our top shelf patrons. And you can join us as a patron at patreon.com/History Happy Hour. So, Chris, we seem to have some people joining us. What does it look like out there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have Sharon Peterson, who was with me on the 8th Air Force Tour, and she's safely back in Wisconsin, so I'm happy to hear that. And Ron Griswold, David Pickler, Lizzie from London. Oh, got a nice crowd.
Lynn Hargrove, Liz Mumford, Walla Morrison. Yeah, so a whole bunch of good people. And we should, I see no reason why we shouldn't just start this show and jump into it. So
the fingers are ready.
Give me a cue. Yeah, I'm ready for you.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. Chris, what's on tap today?
Yeah, well, it's nice. Always nice to have old friends back. So our guest this week is History Happy Hour alum Eric Jay Dolin, and he is the best-selling author, as many of you remember, of several books of maritime history, including Leviathan, Rebels at Sea, and Black Flag, Blue Waters. He's joining us this week to discuss his latest book, Left for Dead, which Menson Bond, the author of Snow and Ice, says is a truly extraordinary story told in gripping fashion. So, Eric, welcome back.
Eric.
Hi, thanks for having me back. Appreciate it.
Really appreciate
Welcome to History Happy Hour from Marblehead, Massachusetts.
Yep.
Do you have a cocktail with you today?
I do. Well, it's not a cocktail. I'm not a cocktail drinker, but it is some
Yuengling
traditional lager. So I'm a big beer drinker. I tend to drink wheat beers mostly, but I had this. I bought it about a week ago. I also drink wine, but I'm going to my in-laws tonight. My wife's on travel, and they always serve wine, so I didn't want to go up.
Yeah, you pace yourself. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm
I'm
drinking a wine for you there.
Oh, good. I love it.
What do you got, Mr. Anderson? Got the scotch as usual?
My Glentor at 12, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, let's all have a drink, and then Chris, start us off.
All right. Well, we're going to start right at the. I love the opening of this book. Right in the introduction, you say, many books tell the story of famous individuals and events that have changed the course of history. This book isn't one of them.
That's get you. That was a dangerous statement. I've been told by my literary agent and a couple of other people in publishing over the years that really the books that sell the best are the ones that are the great man or great woman books about, not just biographies, but stories about individuals or a couple of individuals that did great things that affected the course of history.
All right.
And
so you decided to throw all that advice to the wind.
Threw that advice away. Well, it's because after my last book, Rebels at Sea, about privateering in the American Revolution, which was about great people, I think, that changed the course of history or helped to change it, I had to look around. I had to find a topic for a book. And I found this book from the late 1970s. It was written by an English professor, and it's titled Shipwrecks and Disasters from 1580 to 1860. So I knew I wanted to stay in the maritime world. And so I'm reading the pages. Each page has a couple of paragraphs, each a different event. So I'm going through the pages and I say, oh, I know that story. That was a story that was told in the Heart of the Sea. That's the story that was told in Skeletons of the Sahara. All these history books. I said, these stories that I know that have been told well. And then I came upon this paragraph that talked about this sealing captain, a guy named Charles Barnard from Hudson, New York, who went to the Falklands right on the cusp or right on the eve of the War of 1812. And through an amazing sequence of events, he and 4 other men, 3 British and another American, were intentionally marooned on the Falkland Islands for 534 days. So I said, this is a great story. And right below it, this English professor, he would include all the primary materials that he was able to find about the story. So the first primary material was a book written by Charles Barnard in 1829 about his experience in the Falklands. And, I've been writing long enough that I've seen the evolution of research. When I started writing seriously in the 1990s, I often had to go to specialized libraries to get information or send away for it. Now with, the internet, Google Books, and historical societies and museums and libraries spending a lot of money digitizing their primary materials, it's just amazing. And in 2 minutes, I had Charles Barnard's book on my computer screen, the one I'm talking to you from. Right. And I read the book and I said, this is a great story. But then the big question is there enough other information from that era, enough other contemporary information to write a book? And I found there's a court battle, and there are depositions, and there's information that has been taken there. There were a lot of newspaper articles. A couple of people involved in the events wrote about it afterwards. There were 3 different logbooks from different ships that were involved, because it's really a story of 3 ships, 2 British and 1 American, coming together on the Falklands at roughly the same time. And some good things and then some really bad things ensue.
Hey, let's talk about those 3 ships. What they're coming there. They all will meet up eventually during the War of 1812. Can you give us a sketch of the 3 ships and what each of them is doing there? I mean, the Falkland Islands is a long way from any place. It's a long way today, and I think it's a lot longer way back in 1812.
Right. Well, one of the ships was the Nina, which is an American sealing vessel which sailed out of New York City on April of 1812. The other ship is the Isabella, a brig, which came from New South Wales, which is Australia, Port Jackson, which is now Sydney Harbor. And they were heading back to London. And they had 54 people on board, including 14 armed Marines and 10 convicts, because that was a penal colony, who had been either pardoned or had served out their time. And 4 of those convicts were ex-prostitutes. And then the third ship was the HMS Nancy, a British warship. So basically what happened, I'll try to tell it really quickly. The American sealing ship goes down, gets to the Falklands in September of 1812. They start sealing. They have no idea that the war has begun. In February of 1813, another American sealing vessel, the Hope, comes by, tells them the war broke out the previous June. They say, and Barnard knew in his contract that he signed with John Murray and Sons, the owners of the Nanina, that should war break out, he was required to go back to the nearest American port immediately. But they took a vote. The 13 men talked about it amongst themselves, and they decided it would be better to stay in the Falklands, continue sealing, continue pulling together seal skins, which were sold in China, and sea lion or sea elephant oil, which was a very good illuminant, rather than heading back and possibly being captured by a British ship. So they think they're totally alone. But then in April, they come upon, they're out sealing and they see smoke rising from an island. They go to investigate, and what do they find? The Isabella, the brig Isabella from Australia, had wrecked on Eagle Island, about 90 to 100 miles away from where the Americans were based. What happened is the Isabella had a captain, George Higton, who was an alcoholic and he liked playing cards, and he preferred doing that and sleeping with one of the prostitutes to sailing the ship. So they almost crashed off of New Zealand, and then they did crash in the Falkland Islands. So the Americans agree to save all of the British castaways, and they realize the British castaways don't know that the war has begun. So they tell them, and the British castaways still agree to this deal that the Americans will get salvage rights to the Isabella, which had crashed. They will get the cargo on board the Isabella minus personal effects, and they will bring these British citizens to South America where they could capture a ship back to London. So everybody's very happy about this deal, and they don't know what's happened. However, the Isabella, right after they crashed and before the Americans came on the scene, the Isabella sent out their 17.5-foot boat to go to Buenos Aires, where a British warship was on station, to get a rescue mission started. And those 6 men on that 17.5-foot boat made it the 1,200 miles. They almost sank at one point. But the Americans and the British have no idea what's happened to the 17.5-foot boat. So the Americans and the British make this agreement. And then while the Americans are preparing to leave and get the Nina ready, Duranda, the Captain Duranda, the British guy of the HMS Nancy, arrives in the Falklands. He hears about the American deal to save the castaways, and he rips it up. He basically says, I don't care. This is war. The Nanina is a prize of war, and all the Americans on board are going to be prisoners of war. Meanwhile, Barnard and about half the Americans and 22 British castaways are preparing the Nanina to leave the Falklands. But what happens? On the way, they encounter really bad weather, and the British demand that the Americans continue on to Eagle Island to get the rest of the castaways. Barnard says, we're running out of food. We can't go ahead in this weather. Let me go to a neighboring island and hunt for hogs and waterfowl, bring back food that we need, and once the weather gets better, we'll leave. Everybody agrees. The British settle down for a minute. Barnard and 4 other men, 1 American and 3 British, go to Beaver Island, which has no beavers on it, which is nearby where they're holed up in the bad weather. They kill a bunch of hogs. They kill a bunch of waterfowl. But before they head back to reunite with the Nanina, the British rush forward again and say, we have to go to Eagle Island immediately. On board the Nanina is Valentine Barnard, Charles Barnard's father. He protests this and says, wait until the hunting party gets back and then we'll go. Well, they don't want to do any of that, the British, and he appeals to Robert Dury, who is the head of the Marines. Remember, there are 14 armed Marines, British Marines. So Valentine appeals to Robert Dury and says, we've got to wait a day or two. The hunting party will come back. Well, Dury didn't have a spine of steel. He agreed with the other British. He said, we're going. So one of the Americans knew something the British didn't, or well, they weren't as cognizant of it as they should be. And that's that sailing around the Falklands is incredibly dangerous. And none of the British knew how to sail in the Falklands. So one of the Americans on board says, okay, I will sail you back to Eagle Island. But first, we have to go to Beaver Island, pick up the hunting party. The British agree. Nanina leaves. They come abreast Beaver Island. And instead of stopping and picking up the hunting party, the British fire 2 guns They barely come to a stop and they sail off. Valentine Barnard, 63-year-old Valentine Barnard, the father of Charles, he is apoplectic, but he can't get the British to stop. So they go back to Eagle Island. The five men in the hunting party, they go back to New Island where the Nina had been, and it's gone. They have no idea what's going on. So they decide to sail to Eagle Island. Well, it's in the middle of winter. It's very treacherous sailing. It's very confusing with 700 islands being in the Falklands. They get lost for about a month. They come back to their island and they decide to try once again. But this time they were so famished and cold that they couldn't make it to Eagle Island. So they go back to their camp on Swan Island, which is about 85 miles away from Eagle Island, where the castaways are and the Nanina is. Well, when the Nanina arrived on Eagle Island, the British commander made all the Americans prisoners of war and says the Nanina was a prize of war because he saw dollar signs in his head. Because during times of war, especially if you read my book, Rebels at Sea, you know that when you capture an enemy ship, if it is a legitimate prize, you get to sell it and split the proceeds between the captain or the owner of the ship and the men on board. So Durand is all happy that he's got the Nina, but the Americans want him to go pick up the hunting party. He refuses for weeks. Finally, he sends out a small boat with 3 men who don't know how to sail around the Falkland Islands to go pick up the hunting party. Of course, they fail. They come back. The HMS Nancy and the Nanina leave the Falklands, leaving those 5 men in the hunting party behind. And the story goes on and on. It's got a lot of twists and turns. And it's so...
Yeah, don't give away everything now. You want people to buy the book.
You're right. I shouldn't give away everything, but I'm laughing because I give a lot of talks on my books. And my wife always used to tell me that I give too good of a summary of my book. And there's some truth to that. I've given about 400 talks over the years, and I can count at least a dozen times that somebody in the audience has come up to me afterwards and said, "You told such a great story. It's so complete. I don't need to buy the book." However, I'm built a certain way, and I almost can't. I tell the story, and if somebody thinks that a 4-minute rendition of what the tale is a good reflection of the book, then they shouldn't read the book anyway. So I don't. I'm not worried about that.
I think you're okay. You're safe. But so, one of the, for me anyway, as I was reading the book, we talk about the 3 ships. We'll talk about them. I'm sure we'll talk more about some of the personalities. But to me, I mean, one of the characters of your story are the Falkland Islands themselves. So
Absolutely.
Maybe you could talk a little bit, because again, to most of us, it's just that little dot off the coast of Argentina where there was a war in the 80s, but we don't know anything about the Falklands. Right. So tell us a bit about the Falklands.
Yeah, I knew very little about the Falklands other than the fact that there was a war in the late 20th century between Britain and Argentina over the Falklands.
Right.
But the Falklands are an archipelago of about 700 islands. If you count the islands that are visible above, during high tide, it's only about 200 islands, and it's about 300 miles to the east of the tip of South America and the Straits of Magellan. It is a very cold, windy, inhospitable place, and during the early 1800s, nobody else was living on it. There wasn't a single tree. The average temperature in the winter is 36 degrees. The average temperature in the summer is 49 degrees. And then you have the average wind speed year round is 18 miles per hour. You add an 18 mile per hour wind speed to 36 degrees, you're in the upper 20s, and there's not a single tree to shield this wind coming off the ocean. So a very difficult place to live. There are a lot of birds there. There are a lot of seals there, of course, and there's fish around the islands, but it's sort of a cold and desolate place. And today, only about 5,000 people live there, and they're concentrated in one little area. So you're absolutely right. The Falklands was a character, and I will preemptively answer a question that everybody asks. Did I visit the Falkland Islands? No. And I have nothing against the Falkland Islands. The reason I didn't visit is because I didn't think I had to visit. It's a pretty major trip to make the Falklands a character, because there are some very good descriptions of the Falkland Islands in the early 1800s written by mariners. And those are what I relied on. And I think that my decision was the right one, because you mentioned at the top of the interview, Menson Bound, one of the people who blurbed my book and helped. He led the archaeological expedition to find the Endurance, Shackleton's voyage last summer.
Right.
When he submitted his blurb, he also sent me a personal email, and he complimented me on basically portraying the Falklands in a very accurate, interesting way. However, I was on Falkland Islands TV, and I'm sure 6 people were watching me. And I said to them, I said, if the book sells well enough, I'll come to the Falklands. I'm not sure it's done well enough yet, but I keep my fingers crossed. I wouldn't mind going to the Falklands, but I have to admit, it's not at the top of my bucket list. Although everybody that's been there,
I was going to say, yeah,
loved it.
I have a customer whose daughter did some computer things for the Falkland Islands government, and she went down there when COVID started, so she was stuck there.
Wow.
And he finally went down to see her. He said, "Oh, it's a great place. It was a short visit, but it was a great place."
Yeah, no, the people are wonderful. That I interacted with a number of them. The owners of Eagle Island, the island where the Isabella crashed, it's Chris and Lindsay May. They own this whole island, 7 miles by about 3.5 to 4 miles, and they are alone on the island, with the exception of 60,000 sheep that they own. And
they must really like each other.
Yes, and their son.
Or they really like sheep.
Yeah, they really like sheep. And their son owns a neighboring island, and he's not quite up to the standards of his parents. He only has 30,000 sheep. So, of course, the other night I gave a talk in Jamestown, Rhode Island, about this book. Oh no, it was in Danvers. I talked about another book in Jamestown.
Getting your talks all mixed up there.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I it came to mind. I don't know why, but because when you mention so many sheep and so few people immediately think of these jokes. There are a lot of jokes.
Yeah.
And you think about that movie, the old Woody Allen movie, Sleeper, where Gene Wilder fell in love with a sheep, and she broke up with him, and he's in an alleyway drinking Woolite. I don't know if you've seen that movie. That is one of the best little segments of the movie. Gene Wilder did a great job. So.
Who knew we were going to there? So I want to. I was talking about your book at dinner with my guests, and I think one of the first people I said, it's about 5 people who are essentially abandoned in the Falklands and what they do for 500 plus days. And he said, well, how do they get around? And I said, they had a boat. And the guest said, well, what kind of boat did they have? And I said, I don't know exactly. I don't remember. What kind of boat do these 5 guys have, and how far can they sail in it? Could they, for instance, as Jim Stark, Lynn Hargrove asks, could they have chosen to sail across the ocean to Buenos Aires? I mean, what kind of boat do they have?
No, they could have possibly. I mean, the 17.5-foot boat, which was a long boat designed to haul lumber primarily, was the one that made it to Buenos Aires, but there were 6 men on board. Could they have made it to Buenos Aires? It was a jolly boat. It was sort of modified. Think of a whale boat. It wasn't 25 feet long. Most whale boats are about 25 feet long, lap strake. They're pretty low to the water, but they're very maneuverable, and they're pointed at both ends so they can go backwards and forwards. This jolly boat had a stern, flat stern, and I would guess, although nobody describes it in the accounts that I read, my guess it was only about maybe 15 feet long. It was like a dory. It did have a small sail. It did have a central mast and a sail and oar locks, so they had oars. I don't think they didn't feel confident, even though Charles Bernard was an accomplished sailor. It never came up in any of the accounts that they thought about sailing into the open ocean with this boat and trying to make it to Buenos Aires or any other place in South America. They just decided to stay there, but they were able to sail this boat about 50, 100 miles to different parts of the Falkland Islands. They had a couple of near tragic, almost life-ending mishaps where they tried to land a few men on a very remote area that was basically some rock shelving and then enormous cliffs. And they wanted to land the men there because that was a good rookery where they could kill more seals, and they needed the skins and the meat. And the boat almost crashed trying to get the men aboard because it couldn't land. And there was another time when the boat came upon some rocks and one of the planks sprang a leak. And another time the mast broke in two and they were able to jerry rig a new mast. So I don't think they ever had confidence enough that that boat, which was in tough shape to begin with, could have made it, to civilization to get to be rescued. That's my sense of it. But it was a relatively small boat. It's like a launch boat that you'd have if you're at the yacht club. I live in Marblehead. There are 5 yacht clubs. I'm not a sailor, I have to admit. Actually, people say, I write a lot about maritime issues. I'm not a sailor. I wrote about whaling. I never killed a whale. I wrote about the fur trade. I never trapped a beaver. I wrote about the China trade. I've never been to China. So I guess I'm sort of an armchair historian. I like experiences, but a lot of the things I write about, they're so exciting to me because they're outside the realm of my own personal experience. But if you are a member of a yacht club or you're in a harbor and those little launches, they take you out to get to your boat, maybe it's something like that.
So, Eric, one of the things, as somebody who grew up in New England and who thought Mystic Seaport was the most wonderful place ever, I was sort of aware of hunting whales, right?
Yes.
But the seal trade, I kind of read about it, but I didn't really understand it or how important it was or what was at stake. So could you just kind of give us some sense of the seal trade? Like, why are they going there? And
Sure. Between the late 1700s and the early 1800s, primarily American sealers, although there were British and some other countries, killed an estimated 2.5 million to 3.5 million seals, mainly fur seals and sea lions. Sea lion pelts were worth less. They were called hair seals. And the main market was China. As you probably know, and many of your listeners know, China was enamored with sea otter pelts. And Captain Cook's men, some of them went to China and they were able to sell pelts in the late 1700s for $100 a piece. Now, sealskins only garnered between 50 cents and $5 a piece. When you multiply that by 2.5 to 3.5 million, you realize this is a significant business. It was not nearly as big as the whaling business, but they actually were sort of coincident in a sense. There were some whaling vessels that would seal on the side to supplement their income, but there weren't many dedicated sealing vessels that went whaling because it's a very different kind of ship. But the other thing that's sort of a relation between whaling and sealing is that the men of the Nanina and other sealing vessels not only killed seals for their pelts, but they also would kill sea elephants, those enormous 2,500 pound animals with very thick blubber. And much like a whaler, they would strip the animals of their blubber, melt it down in trypots, just like they did in whaling voyages. And the oil that issued forth from sea elephants was second only in price and illumination qualities to sperm oil from a sperm whale. So the Nanina not only killed seals, they also killed a lot of elephant seals, or fur seals and sea lions. So that the sea lion industry from the late 1700s to about the 17 teens, late 17 teens, and then it came
the 18 teens,
18 teens. And then it came roaring back in the end of the century when Alaska opened up. There was a lot of sealing, and there were international sealing treaties that were put in place to keep people from basically destroying the entire populations up there. So sealing was a big industry. it is overshadowed by far by the whaling industry. Well, although we have Moby Dick with Melville, but James Fenimore Cooper wrote a book on the sealing industry, but it didn't do as well. About the sea life, the going sealing. It's a fascinating industry, and I knew it's funny. I mentioned whaling. I wrote a book, Leviathan: The History of Whaling in America, and I really learned a lot, and I enjoyed writing the book, and I think a lot of people enjoyed it. But I got a lot of nasty emails when that book came out from people who just thought whaling is horrific, and I would respond to them, you're right, I'm not a fan of modern whaling, but I'm talking about history. And I have to tell you, it was interesting. I thought about it in the back of my mind, since the core of this book, or not the core, I mean, most of it is about other stuff, but one of the main features of this book is the sealing industry. I have gotten a number of emails from people, and I've heard from people at talks that they found it difficult to read the book because of the sections where I talk about sealing. Again, this is history. I use the sealing industry as a way to tell a broader story about human nature and the foibles and frailties and strengths of human nature. Basically, what people do, both good and bad, when faced with a horrific situation. And some people have compared, I never thought about this, but some people have said, the stories you tell in Left 4 Dead are sort of like some of the stories in my office workplace, where people are stabbing each other in the back, leaving them on an ice floe, to defend themselves. Anyway, I never thought about that.
Well, it's a different sort of water cooler, but yeah.
So these five guys who are not, I think it's fair to say, all good friends, and they certainly are not over the period of time, 535 days. It's amazing to me. They discover their ship's not there, and they're a little panicked, and they look around for it, and they don't find it, and then they just sort of go, okay, I guess we get on with our lives, and they don't try to curl up and die. They don't. They just kind of get on with it. And they get on with it for a year and a half. And during that time, they also continue to do sealing. Like they want to pile pelts for the moment that they get rescued, so that their time's not wasted. I mean, it feels like they're pretty. They're not okay with being abandoned, but they're. I mean, nobody dies. Nobody dies in this story. I mean, I think there's one sailor who dies, one person who dies from being whipped from his wounds, but basically no major character dies in this story. I don't know. It's just kind of this astonishing survival thing. How do they keep alive for 18 months in these incredibly harsh conditions?
Well, mariners in the early 1800s, and especially some of these mariners, in particular Charles Bernard, are very skilled at going to places where either nobody lives or sometimes hostile natives live and surviving. They are a different breed than your average person today. So they had a lot of survival skills. Charles Bernard had been to the Falklands a couple of times before. He prepared one of the first maps ever made of the Falklands. He knew what resources were there. He knew many of the islands very well. So he was well positioned to take advantage of, for example, the hogs that populated a few of the islands and the waterfowl. He also had his dog, Scent, who was an excellent hunter, with him. And I think without Scent, it might have ended a little bit differently. They certainly would have had to change their diet, because only with Scent, this dog, could they have captured hogs, which are way too fast for the men who didn't have guns. They just had knives and clubs and one lance. So they were able to live off the land, essentially, because some of them had the skills, but also adversity introduces a man to himself, as some famous philosopher said. That quote, I came into my life when I was in my early teens. I can't remember where it came from. And it also brings to mind, I'm sorry to all these movie references or comedy references, but it brings to mind The 2,000-Year-Old Man by Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner. Carl Reiner is asking Mel Brooks, how did you survive for 2,000 years? And he says, will to live. And Carl Reiner says, Dr. Will to live? And no, Mel Brooks says, the will to live. I wanted to survive. I think that's very strong. And I believe that a lot of people put in very scary situations don't decide to curl up and die. They fight with everything they have to make it. And these people had an advantage. They had a lot of knowledge. They would spend months, sometimes years at sea, having to rely on their own wits, not only to maintain their ship, but they had to stop to get water, to get food. They had to fix things on their ship. So these are very resourceful people who are skilled in many different trades that revolve around maritime culture. So I think they had some built-in benefits, but they had some wild times. I mean, as you mentioned, at one time, 4 of the men, sort of prompted by this one bully, left Charles Bernard alone on New Island for 2 months. They took his dog. They took almost everything he had. They came back. They begged to come back in. And Charles Bernard, who was a religious man, turned the other cheek, brought them back in. He really wanted his dog back. But then the bully that had instigated the other 4 men leaving, he was such a jerk that the other 4 men got together and they marooned him on another island until he behaved better. So it is amazing that nobody died. And from a purely, this is maybe a strange thing to say, but from a purely commercial standpoint, I think if a bunch of people had died, the book would even be more exciting for people because look at the genre that is one of the most popular in America, at least. Murder mysteries. One of the most horrible things you could do to another human being is kill them, yet we can't get enough of these murder mysteries. People love it when people die. And I have to admit that when you write about people dying, which I'm doing in a current book that I'm working on, or being murdered, it does add a little excitement to the writing. And I don't know what that says about me or everybody else. Maybe we're just basically animals, but when dramatic things like that happen, it's more engaging. Why do you think 2020, the TV show, and all these nightly shows about horrific people doing horrific things do so well?
Yeah, well, I mean, so kind of picking up on that, because I guess, you know, I as I'm reading some of these personalities, I'm looking for those admirable human traits that you just talked about, but I see a lot more despicable involved. But speaking of the American crew, maybe you could talk more about them, because they're it was unusual, you know, as you point out, that there were multiple captains on the ship.
Right.
That was interesting. And I also thought it was interesting that you said that there were a number of African Americans.
Yes.
In the crew. And so how do you know about them? Did they get treated any differently? I mean, how do they enter the story? I mean,
well, there were 5 captains on board, which is a very strange circumstance, but it largely was a result of the ongoing hostilities between Great Britain and the United States. I mean, Great Britain, after the American Revolution, they always thought that the American experiment was going to fail. And but in the meantime, they got involved in the Napoleonic Wars, and the British Navy needed men, and they were very aggressive with impressment. So they were impressing a lot of American sailors, claiming that they were in fact British, to man the British warships. And that impressment had a big impact in the United States. Not only did it help bring us into the War of 1812, but it also caused a lot of merchants, including sealing merchants or captains and owners, to pull back and stay in port rather than risk getting captured or stopped by the British. So there are a lot of unemployed sealing captains and sealing crews. So for whatever reason, Charles Bernard and James Murray and Son were very risk-taking individuals. And even though the drums of war were beating already, they decided that going to the Falklands might be very profitable, because there have been very few sealing voyages for about 5 or 7 years. So very few seal skins had been making it to China. So the market, the demand might be quite great. So they decided to launch this venture. And because there were so many sealing captains out of business, not working, Charles Bernard, when he could choose his crew, he chose some of the most skilled people. It turned out to be a little bit of a problem because captains are used to being in charge and they don't work well together. But there were a number of captains on board. They each had to put up a $5,000 bond that contributed, or sort of not guaranteed, but a bond to the success of the voyage to get it off the ground and pay for all the supplies. Then in addition to them, there were only 13 men on board. 6 of them were African Americans. That is not unusual in the early 1800s. In fact, I wrote a book on pirates. One of the most interesting things about the golden age of piracy in the late 1600s and early 1700s is that quite a few of the pirates were black men. Some were slaves that had been enslaved individuals that had been captured by the pirates, ships, and they joined the crew. Others were sold back into slavery. But it was mentioned by one historian, and I think it's true, that the deck of a pirate ship in the early 1700s was one of the most equality-laden spaces for black individuals at that time. And in the early 1800s, and certainly through the golden age of whaling in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and in the 50s, it ended in the 50s, there were quite a few black men on whaling ships, on sealing voyages, and other kinds of merchant voyages. And when you're relying on somebody else for your life, maybe you become a little more colorblind and you get to know them. You like them as individuals, and you can look past the biases that are in the culture that you are a part of. However, I don't want to paint it that whaling ships or sealing ships were models of equality and kumbaya. They weren't. There were a lot of racists on a lot of those ships, but there were quite a few black men who rose through the ranks, who became first mates. There were some black men who became captains of vessels, and I saw no indication in the primary materials that I had access to that the black men on board the Nanina were treated any differently than another crew member. But because black men were relatively invisible in society, I wasn't able to find out a lot of information about men. One of them, though, Jacob Green, in his book, Charles Bernard mentions that he was one of the most competent sailors that he had ever worked with. So again, when you're relying on somebody else for your life, which is what you're doing when you head out from port and you sail 3 months in the open ocean, if they're good at what they do, you appreciate them. You don't denigrate them.
Right.
So in your book, the Americans are good-hearted, merciful people. And then
you were waiting for that. You were waiting for that. Rick.
You know, I waited 40 minutes for this, and then the British come in, and they are the hard-hearted people, and the hard-heartedest is Captain Durandra. Tell us about him. He's kind of the villain of your story, if there is one. Tell us about him.
Listen, I love the British people, and many of the British. You know, I think of John Oliver, the guy in he does that nightly program. He always is making bad comments about British history, how horrible it is. Well, American history is equally horrible in many respects. So any country that's been around for a long time has things in the closet that are pretty bad. In this instance, yes, the British, and Duranda in particular, because he wasn't able to look beyond his immediate goal, which was to gain glory and perhaps profits from the circumstance that he had been placed in. He wasn't able to look beyond that to the humanitarian and just what a good-natured human would do in the circumstance. So he is definitely the villain. And the other British people, including some who are fairly high-ranking, educated individuals, they also come across as villains because they didn't speak up and argue with Duranda. They had limited opportunity. He could have ruled over them anyway, but none of them, who felt horrible, as they said in their later commentaries about how the Americans were treated by Duranda, none of them spoke up. And in fact, when Duranda and the Americans, minus the hunting party, went back to Rio de Janeiro and told their story to Rear Admiral Sir Manly Dixon, a great name for a Rear Admiral, Sir
Manly Dixon.
He was horrified. He thought that Duranda did exactly the wrong thing in this situation, and he was absolutely horrified that they left 5 men, 3 of whom were British citizens, behind. And when Duranda finally made it back to England, his reputation was pretty shot because of the actions that he took in the Falkland Islands. So yes, I will admit, in this book, the British don't come off looking too good, but many of the Americans don't come, not necessarily angels. I mean, really, my reading of it is Charles Bernard, even though he did the right thing in many instances, he was an arrogant SOB. I mean, he was a very large man. He liked throwing his weight around. He liked being in charge. And he put the fear of God into some of the fellow captains, one of whom went to bed at night with a knife nearby because he thought he was going to be murdered in his sleep by Charles Bernard. So, you know, I happen to believe that on average, most people are good. But I also believe that a significant percentage of people are really bad. It's a small percentage, but unfortunately, they hijack a lot of the narrative of life.
I was going to say, Eric, like, because then they all appear in your book because people are pretty awful in your book. Okay, so Catherine Byerhurst has a question, and we're somewhat familiar with her. And she wants to know about the women on the Isabella. Whatever happened to them?
Well, again, not a lot of information, but one of the women, Captain Dury's wife, she gave birth to a child on the Falklands. As far as we know, the first, or certainly one of the first Western Europeans, Europeans born on the Falkland Islands. She went back to England, and her husband, you have to read the book to get the story. He sort of comes off rather poorly, and she's a real tough woman. He dies. She lives out the rest of her life relatively unremarkably. The prostitutes who are on board, there are only a total of 7, I think it's 7 women. And again, one of the difficulties of writing about the early 1800s, when you're writing about average people, which is people that don't make a big mark on history, is that getting real information about what they did beyond this one unique event was very difficult. So I don't have a lot of information. I don't have any information in the book about what happened to the 4 ex-prostitutes. I wish I did. That problem plagued me with my privateering book, my whaling book. The crew members, with only a few exceptions, they fade into the mists of history. Pirates too, some of whom settled in New England. Again, none of them wrote memoirs. Yeah. You don't get a lot of information about them. Maybe a dedicated genealogist could have found more, but I looked pretty hard. So that's another reason why I think people gravitate to writing books about the, quote, great men and women of history and the great singular events, because they're so compelling that people write tons about them. That's why there are 16,000 plus books on Abraham Lincoln. That's why there are probably 50,000 books on the Civil War. So I decided to go in a different direction. And one of the negatives of doing so is being able to tell a fuller story about your characters. It eluded me. Maybe there's a better researcher out there that it wouldn't have eluded, but it eluded me.
Well, why do you think this doesn't become a well-known story at the time? I mean, Charles Bernard eventually writes a book about it, but 50 or 100 years later, this would have been headline news around the world. People would have been interviewing the castaways, et cetera. Is it because of the state of journalism of the time? Is it because nobody died? And so it wasn't an interesting story. There's some news coverage, but really very, very little.
I don't have a good answer to that question because I can point to other examples, including the current book I'm working on, where a lot of people died. And it was a fairly big story at the time where they just disappear. I'll give you an example. You know the book In the Heart of the Sea by Nathaniel Philbrick. It's basically about the sinking of the Essex. That was an enormous story in the 1800s. It totally faded from view. And the only reason it was resuscitated by Nat is he was given a unique logbook that was never seen before. And it gave him a different angle into the story. And once again, it was brought to light. I mean, probably a lot of people knew that there were some whale ships that were sunk by whales, but nobody knew the story that well. There are other books like that, stories like Skeletons of the Sahara about a crash on the western coast of Africa. That was a huge story at the time, but then it fades. And there are books written, especially in the 1930s and 40s. There were probably 15 anthologies of maritime disasters that were put together and were pretty big sellers. A lot of them had the same disasters over and over again. And Charles Bernard and the Nina made it into a couple of those books. But a lot of those stories disappeared. I don't have a good answer other than the fact that the tide of history rolls on. Bigger stories are told. And unless somebody resuscitates it with a new take on an old story, it's going to disappear. And the book that I'm working on now, which is about a shipwreck in the Pacific in the 1830s, was a pretty big story. And there was a naval rescue involved, and there's a lot of people killed, and interesting things happen.
And the British come out better on this next book, right?
The British come out much better in this book.
Okay, good.
Yes. Some of the Americans, not so much. But there are natives involved. So but this story also totally faded, and there hasn't been a book written about it since it happened. There was a fictional account written about it, but anyway, you'll have to read the book. I'll have to finish writing the book. Got a lot of work to do.
And don't tell us the story before you finish writing the book.
I won't.
Get it in the right order.
I guess it's sort of not a very good answer, other than the fact that if you look at history books that are published now, I am certain, and I know for a fact, that you can find many topics or many stories that you'll say, even somebody who's well-versed in American or world history will say, hey, I never heard of that before. This is a fascinating story. So they say that every 20 or 30 years, historians rediscover the same stories. I don't know if that's 100% true, but I'm at a point in my career such as it is, where I want to find stories that haven't been told before, but I am being pulled in a different direction because I can look at books that are published, and I think on average, there's a lot of truth to the great men, great women, great event angle. The books that often sell the best, and as writers, I'm a full-time writer. I'm not doing this for my health. The books that often sell the best are the ones about well-trod topics from a slightly different angle. Mm-hmm. And, a good example is Hampton Sides, who you recently interviewed, and I was on a panel with in Mississippi 2 or 3 weeks ago. I can't remember, about Captain Cook. Captain Cook has had a lot of books written about him. And I read Hampton's book. It's very good. I thought it was good. I don't know if it really exposed anything totally new that hadn't been written in other books. I'm not a Captain Cook scholar, but how many more books are we're going to have more books about Captain Cook. I guarantee it. In 10 years, 15 years, we're going to have more books about Abraham Lincoln and his dog or whatever. I don't know. They're going to find some other angles to go into that story, or Alexander Hamilton or George Washington. And I don't begrudge people writing about them, but from my perspective, unless I find something totally new about these people that nobody knew, I'm bored. But the reading public is not bored, so I'm out of sync with everybody, and I'd probably be.
Well, it seems to be working though, right?
Yeah, it works. I'd probably be a much more famous and wealthy writer if I had stuck to the great man, great woman, great event.
You're famous to us, so that's what counts.
I mean, I think I'm safe in saying that Charles Bernard gets rescued because you told us that he wrote a book later.
Sure.
You know, in the interest of full disclosure, Wally wants to know, as much as you want to reveal here, how and who made the rescue. So how did he get on?
Two whale ships before the end of the War of 1812. There were a lot of British whale ships that were still roaming the seas, doing multiple things. Some of them were heavily armed, and they were capturing American whale ships, the few that made it out of port. But a lot of them were just continuing to whale. And the thing that's fascinating is during times of war, if you really look at it, society continues. People find a way. There's still merchant activity going on. So these two whale ships, the Asp and the Indispensable, came to the Falklands to get some water and food. However, a year before, when the court case about the Nanina was heard in London, the British Admiralty was mortified, just like Sir Manley Dixon, about how the Americans had been treated. So a circular was written up, sent out to all the stations in the Pacific and the Atlantic, saying if any British ships go to the Falklands, look for these 5 men, this hunting party. The captain of one of the whaling ships had read that circular, but he totally forgot about it. He was just going to the Falklands, as many people did, New Island, which is on the western coast, the western part of the Falklands. He was just going there to get some water and some food, which a lot of people did. But then he sees 2 guys waving from a rock. He goes, wow. And then he puts 2 and 2 together and he rescues the
Then
5.
he remembers.
He remembered. Then he remembered. Oh, you're those guys. And it was, and that's a part of the story to me that's almost as interesting. This is a time they didn't have cell phones. They didn't have internet. You go off on a voyage, nobody hears from you for years. And here they've been marooned for 534 days. It took Charles Bernard another almost 2 years to make it back to New York. And nobody, his family, the owners of the ship, had no idea what had happened to him. That's just amazing to me.
That's crazy.
In the few moments we have left, you know, is there a moral for this story? Is there a takeaway beyond, wow, what an interesting, fascinating tale? What's the sum up there?
Don't go to an uninhabited island you don't necessarily trust. No, actually,
No,
Barnard,
keep your dog. Keep your dog, I
keep
think,
your
is the moral.
No, Barnard actually wrote in the end of his book some advice. I don't know if it's a moral, but he said that any other American ships that find shipwrecked British sailors or other sailors, if they outnumber you, don't save them. if there are only a couple of them, then save them. So that's not really a very good moral.
It's a very harsh, harsh moral coming out of your book.
Harsh moral. So I don't know. The moral is, you know, if you go to sea in the early 1800s, this is looking back, it was very dangerous. A lot of people never made it back. So I guess the moral of the story is be very open-eyed about the risks that you're embarking, you know, of the voyage you're embarking on, and try to get a good measure of the people you're interacting with so that you're not put in a bad situation. I don't know.
Or take up farming.
Be resilient and have a good dog, I think.
Have a good dog. Yeah, the dog.
That's what I think.
Yeah. Oh, people love the dog. I get
Scent is a great character.
Scent is a great character.
And Scent keeps almost dying, and like he's lying there by the fire. But then he comes back. So, Eric Dolan, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your book. New book, Left for Dead, Shipwreck, Treachery, and Survival at the Edge of the World. I know it feels like we told the whole story, but guess what? We didn't. There's a lot more there. And we hope you buy it and check it out. It's definitely worth the read. I was sitting there reading it on the bus as we were driving through France and Netherlands, and I enjoyed it. It was immense fun. So
great. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Eric, thank you so much. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Wow. He's a great interview to have. Lots of fun.
Yes. He's kind of picking on the British again.
I couldn't help but bring that up. I mean, it's just a factual point in the story. You know, they come through at the end. I mean, they've Manley Dixon and all that is good. Next week, Chris, we'll have an encore episode. It's the first of 3 encore episodes we have in a row because of travel and not being available on Sundays. And this is going to be, we're going to replay our episode with William Stewart Nance, who's the author of Commanding Professionalism, about 9th Army Commander General William Simpson and his Chief of Staff, Mr. Moore. And that was a great interview. William Simpson is a great, relatively unknown World War II general.
Absolutely.
And so please check that out. And meantime, before you get there, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us at Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on patreon.com, and browse historyhappyhour.com, and be kind to your British friends.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Be safe.